I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Memorial Day behind us, July 4th, a few weeks away. That means the summer movie season kicking into high gear. Rocket Man hits theaters this week. A big-budget biography of rock star Elton John features plenty of music, glitter, drugs, gay sex, a first for a major studio. Spider-Man Far From Home opens in early July, proof that Avengers Endgame was far from the end of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. New York Times film critic A.O. Scott will preview the summer slate of movies for you. But we begin with the extraordinary theatrics of politics. House Speaker Pelosi says President Trump, quote, wants to be impeached so he can be exonerated by the Senate. Times columnist Maureen Dowd wondered last Sunday if Trump was, quote, a sinister genius laying traps to get himself impeached to animate the base ahead of the election. Is impeachment really a political winner for Trump? Meanwhile, the president and the speaker are trading very personal insults after Pelosi said Trump was engaged in a cover-up and Trump reportedly stormed out of a meeting on infrastructure after 3 minutes.
I walked into the cabinet room. You had the group, Crying Chuck, Crazy Nancy. I tell you what, I've been watching her, and I have been watching her for a long period of time. She's not the same person. She's lost it.
I pray for the President of the United States. I wish that his family or his administration or his staff would have an intervention for the good of the country. If you don't stop honoring your oath of office, I can't work with you. That's basically what he's saying. Maybe he wants to take a leave of absence. I don't know.
I'm an extremely stable genius.
Trump also retweeted a doctored fake video that made it look like Pelosi was slurring her words. There it is in a nutshell, American politics in 2019. So what are the potential political risks and rewards of impeachment? What will be the fallout from the nasty Trump-Pelosi war of words so far? Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board, Clyde Haberman, a contributing writer for the New York Times. Where is this going? This is a year or more, 18 months before the election, and these people are fighting with each other in the mud already.
Where's it going? Who knows? I mean, I do believe, though, that Bob Mueller this week gave those who in the House who won impeachment a lot more to work with. Some of our stories and other stories have said there was some ambiguity there. I saw no ambiguity. I heard him say, if this guy weren't president of the United States, I would have indicted his rear end months ago. And since I can't do it, Congress, it's your turn. I don't know how else to interpret what he said. So I think the move toward impeachment just became stronger. And I think a lot of people who were sitting on the fence on this would welcome it. I confess I'm one of them.
Is that reading too much into what he said? Is that wishful thinking on the part of people who want impeachment?
I don't see how else to interpret. The man is very careful with his words, and I don't think there's any room for ambiguity here.
Mara, what do you think?
You know, I think it's unfortunate that Mueller has resisted testifying before Congress, not because his work doesn't speak, volumes about the conclusions that he came to.
Literally volumes.
Literally 400 or so pages, but because, I believe that he has expertise that he should share with the American people, and that as a public servant, he owes it to Congress and to the American people to answer questions. Of course, I'm a journalist, so I believe that there's value in that. But I think we saw how powerful his brief statement was when he did it before the cameras. We heard his voice for the first time since he was FBI director, really. And I also think there's a lesson there that we're just in a political environment right now, for better or worse, probably for worse, in which if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you. And I think that someone is going to be the president of the United States, unfortunately, who's just, driving the narrative that he wants, even though it's usually a pack of lies, constantly on Twitter. He has his platform, as all presidents do. So I think the Democrats should, I hope, learn some valuable lessons from that heading into 2020. They cannot allow the president to tell their story for them.
Or someone else will tell a story, as the Attorney General did, to try and
Exactly.
preempt his story.
And a Mueller mistake, in my view, was that he waited basically 2 months
That's right.
before doing this, and that's unfortunate.
What happens if Congress calls him? Is he simply going to point to the report and say that speaks for itself?
Well, he could. I mean, again, I hope he doesn't. So far, Congress has called various people around the president, and they've stonewalled them. So, and I see no consequences coming of this, not yet anyway. At some point, do they have the power to have marshals come and grab folks by the collar and march them before the committee? I'd like to think they do.
But they can't make them speak.
No, they can't. It's like, leading the horse to water. But I said this on this show a couple of weeks ago. I still feel it. Congress has to show that the House Democrats have to show that they indeed, and they have been showing, I believe, that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so while they're pursuing this impeachment question, pass bills. And if the slow walker in the Senate, McConnell, who outdid himself in hypocrisy this week by saying that if there's a Supreme Court vacancy next year, he'll happily fill it after having stonewalled, use that word again, Merrick Garland. The man is unbelievable. He redefines hypocrite. But anyway, the Democrats in the House have to legislate and do what they're there for, and also investigate the president. There's no reason they can't do both at the same time.
There are 2 quotes this week from House Democrats that suggest that they would agree with you. Jerry Nadler, the head of the Judiciary Committee, said that Mr. Mueller told us a lot of what we need to hear, which suggests that he did say something more definitive than ambiguous. And Hakeem Jeffries of Brooklyn said there is a difference between reading the book and seeing the movie on the big screen. Now, the Times had a story this week saying that, interestingly enough, black Democrats are pushing harder for impeachment because their constituents are urging them to. Do we have any sense that that's so? And if so, why?
Well, I think it's not just black Democrats, although that's what we saw this week. It's Democrats whose districts are safe, who represent the Democratic base. And because of the extreme polarization and gerrymandering over the past decade and a half, you have a lot of Democrats you have some Democrats who help make up the majority in the House, who have seats that are not safe. And it's those Democrats, I think, who Nancy Pelosi is most concerned about. Forcing them to take a vote on impeachment is one of the serious risks that the Democrats could come across. But I continue to be not convinced that a majority of Democrats, even in those swing districts or purple districts, wouldn't support impeachment at this point. I'm not sure that it becomes a rallying cry to knock off Democrats in moderate districts, although I think that's the fear.
Well, is the president goading the Democrats
Absolutely.
into impeachment?
Okay.
And
Of course.
he is then presumably making a calculated decision that it's in his political interest.
Absolutely.
Is it?
Well, it could be, but again, I'm sort of echoing what I've said in this seat before.
You can say it again.
Well, but
It's
just the whole notion is he wants to play to his base and all the rest of that and fire them up. Their hair would be in flames if they were any more fired up. I don't know. I don't see how this could affect those who support him or those who can't stand him. I'm not sure how many people there are in the middle between those two forces. I think very few, frankly.
I agree, and I also think that there's a risk that the Democrats don't always calculate, which is shocking, they should after what happened in 2016, which is they need to turn out their own base.
Right.
And frankly, a lot of Democrats stayed home. And had those Democrats voted in 2016, we wouldn't be in this situation. And I think they really, that the Democrats need to also think about how to respond to black voters and liberals in their base who, and not just on impeachment, on a variety of issues. But I think this kind of this quest for this elusive, moderate white Democrat who voted for Trump is really a misadventure. And of course, you fight for every vote if you're a candidate. And it's not to say that you don't go to Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and you don't talk about trade or all. I'm not saying that. But I do think that the Democrats would do well to actually be responsive to the voters that are their voters.
And the midterms suggested that those voters can come out and
That's
do
right.
come out and possibly will
That's
come
right.
out.
Indeed.
There was a strange tweet from the president this week,
How did you
which
single that one
presumably
out?
was a mistake. He said, "I had nothing to do with Russia helping me to get elected."
Right, well, he
he
just
sent out
admitted
a
that
retweet right after that, but that was suggesting that he was acknowledging that Russia did help him get
Well,
elected.
He did acknowledge it. Okay, he may have retweeted, but yeah, clearly that's what he said. Now, granted, he's not the most facile person with the English language or any language, but yeah, it's quite clear. Look, everything that he says is basically a lie. Always reminded of the old Mary McCarthy line about Lillian Hellman. Everything she says is a lie, and that includes and the. Mm-hmm. And that is absolutely true in the case of this president, and because his interpretation of what Mueller said yesterday is 180 degrees opposite to reality. And clearly Russia did help him. It didn't want Hillary Clinton to be president, as he insists. And he has these enablers who are going to have to answer someday, whether to the electorate or to God, whoever, and that includes our former Mayor Giuliani and others, who are fostering an absolute lie. It is a presidency that is built on a tower of falsehoods.
It just seems that regardless of whether the president was complicit, even if his campaign operatives were aware of Russian help and Russian interference, then they had a duty to somehow report it.
It's like him saying, you know, he didn't know about the cover-up of John McCain's name on that destroyer on his trip to Japan. It makes no difference, I would argue. The point is that the sycophantic core around him knew that this would please him greatly, and it was sort of the way, to me it was very similar, to localize it, to Bridgegate with Chris Christie, who says he didn't know about it. That's not the point. The point is the people around you thought they would be pleasing you no end by making life miserable for those folks.
Creating an atmosphere in which that would happen.
This is the exact same thing to me.
Now, what about Nancy Pelosi, and how long can she hold out against these forces for impeachment?
You know, that's
Or is this all calculated on her part too?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know, but I think that the drums are beating louder and louder for impeachment. And, you know, the fundamental issue here is that whether it's impeachment or a legal proceeding from, you know, the Southern District of New York or elsewhere, or the voters in 2020, if this president is not held accountable and the people around him are not held accountable, our democracy, you know, is in serious trouble. And part of that is because there's just a fundamental sense of fairness and honesty that's at stake here. And I think, you know, when you outline all the president's, you know, transgressions or crimes, it's like, is this about, you know, the person who's committing these crimes, or is it about the crimes themselves? Because there are a lot of people in America who have been held to account for far less than what the president has done. And so there are a lot of questions about how he can be above the law.
Yeah. Mara Gay, Clyde Haberman of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And coming up next, summer movies usually mean a lot of superheroes. We can use some of those. And sequels, and Woody and Buzz Lightyear are back this year in Toy Story 4. The Times' A.O. Scott standing by to give you his picks and pans.
No. Not acceptable.
This is not okay.
Who allowed you to be this beautiful?
Who allowed you to be this beautiful?
Who allowed you to take my breath away?
That was a clip from the movie Booksmart, which the Times called a fast, brainy, nasty, but nice teenage comedy. It was directed by the actress Olivia Wilde. Also on tap this summer, Dark Phoenix, the latest offering in the long-running X-Men franchise, starring Jennifer Lawrence, Michael Fassbender, and Jessica Chastain. So what are the must-see and must-avoid movies this summer? A.O. Scott is the New York Times' chief film critic. Tony, what's on tap this summer?
Well, I haven't seen a lot of them. It always, you know, this time of year I'm looking ahead. thinking about what I'm looking forward to and what I'm dreading, just like everybody else. So I get to them a little sooner, but not that much sooner. There are a few things that are interesting, as you say. There's Dark Phoenix, the latest X-Men chapter. There's another Spider-Man. And these are the pieces of the Marvel universe that aren't yet under the Disney umbrella. The X-Men, since Disney acquired Fox, will probably end up being part of that larger universe. But Spider-Man and the X-Men are sort of their own franchises within the thing, and they've been around for a long time, for as long as I've been in this job, I think. So we'll see if there's anything new under the sun. There's also yet another Toy Story movie coming up, and this one I have mixed feelings. I mean, I love the Toy Story franchise, and I thought that Toy Story 2 was a perfect movie, and I was suspicious of Toy Story 3 coming along, but Toy Story 3 I thought was a wonderful movie, and I thought it brought the whole thing to a kind of a nice end when Andy, the boy who has all these toys, grows up and gives them away. But apparently there's more water in this well too, so there are going to be some new toys and some new adventures.
As Mel Brooks said, it's the end of Spaceballs, the search for more money.
Well, exactly.
Yes.
That's why they make movies. Yeah.
And we go from in biopics from Bohemian Rhapsody to Rocket Man.
Yes. Rocket Man, I liked much better than Bohemian Rhapsody, and partly for the reason that it doesn't behave like a standard biopic.
Also because that was the first album you bought.
Yes, was Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy when I think I was 10 years old. And so I grew up on Elton John, and even though my musical taste kind of changed over the years, I found myself sitting in this movie knowing every single word, and enjoying the slightly new versions of the songs. This isn't a movie like Bohemian Rhapsody where you have the star lip syncing over the familiar recorded versions, but they recorded them anew, which is sort of a mixed bag because Taron Egerton, who plays Elton John, is not the singer necessarily that Elton John is, but they sound a little different, and they're embedded in the story in an interesting way. So it's almost as much a jukebox musical, really, as it is a biopic. So the songs are used not just as, and then he wrote this song, and then they went in the studio and recorded this song, but to dramatize his emotions, other episodes in his life. So it has a much more kind of theatrical and fantastical feel to it than a lot of musician biopics do.
Is there any thread to the movies this summer? I mean, we have biopics, we have sequels like Godzilla, we have animals like Lion King, zombies, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, unless the theme is kind of
more of the same.
More of the recycling stuff we loved in the past. I mean, I think that the great nostalgist of American cinema is probably Quentin Tarantino. He has a new movie coming
Which sounds
Which
great.
it sounds quite interesting. It played in Cannes, and there was some enthusiasm for it there. And I mean, all of his movies have borrowed the styles and genres and attitudes of the film past, but this is the first one that's really set in the movie world, in Hollywood in 1969, around the time of the Tate LaBianca Manson family murders, with Brad Pitt and Leo DiCaprio as a movie star and a stuntman, and so that I think kind of may set the table. There's a lot of nostalgia. I mean, there's a lot of kind of looking back, whether it's looking back at the wonderful, excessive, crazy rock and roll world of the 70s and 80s, or even I think the Toy Story movies are always about sort of nostalgia. So I think that might be the theme. Gee, remember when I don't know, things were great.
And The Lion King, we're sort of running out of versions, but this one with real animals.
Well, this is part of what Disney is doing. They did it with Aladdin that opened last week.
Which you described as pointless in an aggressive way.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
Well, it
didn't sound good.
No, I didn't enjoy it. A lot of people went to see it. It made tons of money. A lot of people went on Twitter telling me, not for the first time, how wrong I was, how out of touch I am. But it's basically, it's taking a story, or as they say in Hollywood, an intellectual property that has made a lot of money for Disney before, and What Disney used to do was bring out in the home video DVD era would be to bring out a new deluxe version of this on DVD, so a new generation of kids their parents would buy it for them. So now what they're doing is remaking their animated classics as what they call live action, which is a bit of a misnomer because there's a lot of CGI. The live action Lion King is not going to be actual trained lions acting out and speaking the words and singing Hakuna Matata. But it's an attempt to, I think, refresh the brand, to get new audiences. But it's pointless because these movies lose some of their integrity and their originality, and they felt, the ones that have come down the pike so far, whether it's Mary Poppins Returns or the new Aladdin or the Jungle Book, they just feel like these weird kind of hybrids. Like they haven't really rethought the story. They haven't reinvigorated the sort of the myths and the characters that everybody loves. It's just an example of, well, people liked this before when we did it this way, so we'll change a few things around it. We'll use this new technology. We'll paint Will Smith blue, and we'll throw it, and the kids will love it. And of course, kids do. Kids like going to the movies.
What about the smaller, more independent movies, like something like Booksmart, which we saw earlier?
Yeah, I mean, Booksmart is terrific. There are always a few that sort of creep in there. There's a wonderful one that I think is still around in theaters called The Souvenir, which I reviewed a few weeks ago with Tilda Swinton and her daughter, Honor Swinton Byrne, in the lead. Terrific, small, thoughtful, but in its way very ambitious movie directed by Joanna Hogg. And there are some other ones. I mean, there's Late Night with Mindy Kaling and Emma Thompson. I mean, there's always a great deal of variety. I think one of the challenges is there's so much to see, and there's so much competition from streaming platforms and from television, that some of the small movies that don't have the kind of the built-in brand awareness that a Pixar movie or a superhero movie or a Disney movie is going to have trouble finding and connecting with.
Well, we saw in the Times the other day that Broadway is doing better than ever. What about the movies when we have so much competition from streaming on TV and on handheld devices? Why do people go to a movie instead?
I think to some degree for the uniqueness of the experience. And one of the things that's undermined in a way by the streaming platforms is that very uniqueness. I think a Broadway show, there's no substitute for it. You're there, you're in the house, you're with the live actors playing the part, and it's going to be unique. What you see that night is never going to be seen again. And I think the movies have obviously always been different, but the movie-going experience has been a sort of a communal ritual in a way. You go sit in the dark, you go with a bunch of friends, you sit with a bunch of strangers, you go by yourself in the middle of the day, but you go and you're out of your house and you're out of your routine. And it's kind of an event and a destination. But if some version of that is available to you at any time on any, as we say now, platform, then that erodes the specialness of it a little bit. So I think people still do go to the movies, and people do still like to go to the movies, but they're in competition with a lot of other forms of almost the same kind of thing.
It's not just for the air conditioning anymore.
Right.
Thanks to A.O. Scott of the New York Times, and I'll add my thoughts next on CODA. If you juxtapose Mayor de Blasio and the words fair or fairest in the New York Times archive, you'll find nearly 700 references. De Blasio is said repeatedly as mayor and presidential candidate that his animating vision has been to make New York the fairest big city in America. No need to parse that. Let's assume that by fair, he means even-handed, impartial, and free from favoritism, although some constituents, if they're contributors, seem to be more equal than others. And let's not quibble over size, whether any small or medium cities are more fair than ours. The latest findings from NYU's Furman Center suggest that with only 30 months left in his second term, the mayor shouldn't squander as much as half that time running for president, not when his agenda at home is half full. During this decade, poverty declined among children, but increased among seniors. The population of homeless shelters has nearly doubled. The proportion of rental apartments available to low and moderate income households declined. The share of households earning more than $100,000 a year rose. The share of moderate and middle income households declined. Housing code violations rose. It was, of course, the evil queen, not Snow White, who kept inquiring who was the fairest. And by fair, she didn't mean equity or mediocrity, but beauty. De Blasio would probably retort that, like statistics, that's in the eye of the beholder. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.